Hello and welcome to episode number 314 of the Armin Show podcast, which covers a variety of topics. We're learning more. There's a community of sorts, and neuroscience, law, economics. Subscribe if you have not. It's very important for me to inform about that. Now, on this episode, we have the author of a book who has done some research in a specific category for the book, Professor Emily Erikson of Yale University Sociology Department joins us. She is the author of Trade and Nation, How Companies and Politics Reshaped Economic Thought. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am glad to have you on. Now, before we get into the book, I tend to like to check on background that leads up to the book, because a book is only a culmination of our thoughts and efforts after the fact of having a reason to do so, or even getting into that field. What has led you to where you are today at Yale?
Well, so this, can I narrow that down to
Yes.
this book, the publication of
Full
this
freedom
book?
here.
I would say that it started probably when I was in undergraduate. I was taking a course on history and structure, and I was just fascinated, completely bowled over by this book called The Islands of History by Marshall, an anthropologist at the University of Chicago, or that was formerly at the University of Chicago. And that book is about Captain Cook and the Marshall Islands, and this kind of like encounter between these two societies. And I thought it was so fascinating. You see structure and history kind of intermeshing in order to produce this huge transformation of both societies. And I wanted to do something like that, which sort of led me to sociology. And it led me to when I started sociology, it led me to look in the area of this sort of age of encounters. So I wanted to find data on these kinds of where the Europe sending out ships and encountering new civilizations that they hadn't encountered before. Directly, at least, there's indirect trade routes and things like that, but not as much, with as much frequency or as directly. So I found this data on the English East India Company, and I ended up writing my dissertation on that. And I published a different book called Between Free Trade and Monopoly, about the English East India Company. Now, I know that that's a little bit of a long way to get to this book, but one of the things that just really struck me as a really sort of a strange coincidence was that almost all of the early important economic tracts in the early modern era, so 1600 to roughly 1750, everything kind of leading up to Adam Smith, all of the really important works were written by these men that were principals of the monopolies of the time, of the chartered companies. And I thought, well, that is a really strange coincidence that almost everything happens to be written by these extremely powerful merchants. And it led me to think about why that was and what it meant for economic theory. And that was the origin of the idea that became this book, the Trade and Nation. I suppose you can't really see it.
That makes sense. Now, by the way, what are chartered companies?
Oh, yeah. So chartered companies are really the first of the organizational form that we would come to think of now as companies. So before, in the medieval era, there's things like guilds, there's partnerships, but there aren't companies in the sense where there's a shared pool of capital. So in the 17th century, chartered companies became, in England in particular, really sort of a popular way of organizing commerce and trade. And the companies are different because lots of people come together into an organized venture. In the chartered companies in particular were given exclusive rights to different areas of trade. So for example, East India Company had exclusive rights to the East Indies, which was a term that was used to refer to pretty much all of Asia and Africa and the Middle East. And other companies had exclusive rights. Other chartered companies had exclusive rights to things like white linen or the Baltic Sea area. But they were large-scale ventures, often engaged in overseas trade with monopoly privileges granted by their company of origin.
Now, the East India Company you have looked at in heavy detail. why that company? Would any other company have sufficed for this kind of analysis?
Well, the English East India Company was a pretty remarkable company. So, in the type of analysis in the book on Trade and Nation, all of the companies have an impact. So it is possible I could have looked at some other companies, the Merchant Adventures, or the Baltic Sea Company, or something like that. But the English East India Company was the most successful, I would say, of these ventures, commercially successful. It made a huge amount of money. And it was also extremely important because, so the people that were engaged in the English East India Company were probably more powerful and wealthier merchants. So that matters for the story. But that company also, it ended up taking colonial control over India, the Indian subcontinent. And so it then became a kind of foundational stepping stone in the expansion of British imperialism overseas, which I think it was not a good thing at all, but certainly something that's important to understand how and why it happened at that time and what led up to it and how that's impacted the world since.
This makes sense. Now, one thing I definitely liked is that you described the detail you went into to look at material from the 17th century and around that time, which is good because sometimes we don't know what the analysis is that goes into how do we look back at the past. We don't have the same tools as we have today. Things looked a little different then, and we're not as electronically data-based. Can you go into some of the detail of the hefty effort you put into to pull out terms that were discussed at that time and what was relevant based on public discourse and whatnot?
Yes. So the book is about the shift in economic discourse that happened in the early modern era, roughly 1600 to 1720. So what I wanted to capture was not just a change that happened in the most phenomenal works of the time, right? So there's always, leading lights that are sort of innovative thinkers and that come up with transformational ideas, or there's even people that do things really different from what people have done before. And sometimes those people get sort of buried in history. There's an example of this Spanish economic thinker, Sarah, who wrote this really incredible book that had a lot of the same insights as Adam Smith's work. But he wrote it about a century or more earlier, but he wrote it in prison. And it was in a little prison library chest buried under all of these other books for like another 200 years. So it's just an example of someone who's a genius, but it doesn't matter if you're a genius if other people aren't picking up the ideas and actually using them in order to inform the larger discourse. So what I wanted to do was to be more systematic and encompassing than previous works of sort of the history of economic thought. And it's really not the fault of people that did the history of economic thought in the past that they couldn't be more systematic, that honestly, they didn't really have the same tools available to them. So if you're just one person with one pair of eyes and 24 hours in each day, there's only so many texts that you can read on your own. There's only so many sort of pairwise analyses that you can engage in. So what I did was I took what is now sort of an amazing available and readily available online corpus of early economic works. And a lot of that is now text readable, and that's through a terrific project with Early Economic Books Online, the text creation partnership that if people are interested, they should definitely check out. So I took, they randomly sampled the early economic texts, or they randomly sampled all texts. So that's really good for getting away from selection bias and other problems, statistic problems, sampling problems. And so I took this corpus that they'd created, and I used topic modeling in order to pick out the most important themes that exist in the works. So, I mean, it's essentially a computer program that looks at patterns of association between words by like across chunks of text. And it produces a number of different topics that are important to the authors of all of these works. And you can see how they kind of change over time and how they relate to each other and how some things become closer together over time and drift apart over time. And what was kind of revealed in this analysis was this significant shift away from kind of a moral evaluation, this kind of spiritual sort of way of thinking about economic behavior. You know, is this just and fair in the eyes of God, which was a sort of a medieval framework for thinking through economic problems, towards one that was based in thinking about national wealth and prosperity.
So now, as far as the change from a more moral discourse to a more practical or numerical analysis that happened, can you tell us about the progression and why it occurred?
Yes. So the progression, I mean, I would say it was sort of a slow transformation, but that if you look at texts in the like 1550, famous texts in 1550, it's going to be fundamentally different in its sort of basic assumptions about what they're trying to accomplish and how they're trying to persuade their audience than something that's published in, say, 1650. But even earlier, 1620, you would really see texts that look like they're sort of from a different universe, almost, you know, like different solar systems, where in 1550s, money is often referred to, money is like evil, merchants are assumed to be evil, and there's a lot of concern about fair exchange and equity, and making sure that people aren't being taken advantage of because of the sort of moral hazards of just engaging in commerce and trying to make a profit off of relationships with other people. By 1650, you lose the kind of assumptions that trade is inherently evil, and instead it's actually being seen as something that it has a positive benefit for the nation and for the community and the Commonwealth, as it was referred to in England, which is where this transformation took place. And the book is really about how and why that transformation occurred. And what I found was that it was something that I didn't really expect, but it was about a combination of the political circumstance of the kind of rising merchant class in England, coupled with the increase in their sort of organizational capacity and political power, and kind of controversy stirred up by the companies of the company form, these chartered companies that were a new way of organizing commerce. So what happens is the companies give these merchants a lot of sort of increased power in the sense of organizational capacity and kind of power to affect the economy. But they're really controversial because they're monopolies and people are excluded from them. So they cause a lot of discontent in society. This controversy spills into the public sphere because merchants are sort of largely excluded from the offices of the government in England. So they want to, essentially, the merchants want to affect trade policy. And trade policy then was essentially, you know, who are you going to grant a monopoly to, and who are you going to exclude from that monopoly? And that was a benefit to the state, because then they would get money from the people that they grant the monopolies to. So these merchants, they want to affect these trade policies, but they don't have direct access really to the government in order to sort of enact their policy preferences. So what they do is they write these texts in the public sphere trying to convince that the representatives in parliament, the constituencies of those individuals in parliament, the Privy Council, the Crown, they're trying to convince them to do certain things about these monopolies. But no one trusts merchants. So this is kind of the interesting thing. No one trusts merchants then. So the merchants have to rely upon something other than their own sort of stature. So they use the principles of science, logic, and empirical data in order to buttress their arguments in that, so that they can convince people that they're just not making self-interested arguments that would let them make more money. But they really were. But they really were.
In fact, they actually were. There's multiple points that come to mind as you're describing this. The strategic value of communication. Most of communication at some point had persuasive intent behind it, and then switching it to more logical and rational framework to make points, even though actually it was still trying to get something across. But okay, we'll switch it to over here. This is more convincing at this time. It's like a new level of competition, and nobody trusts merchants. That's pretty good stuff right there. Right? Because what is the merchant trying to do? Maybe sell, and then maybe we'll use any method to sell. And then, so you have to be wary on the other end. That makes sense. What are some key terms or phrases or descriptions that merchants would use, or topics they would bring up that were relevant at the time? Is there any key terms or phrases that showed up a lot in examining?
Yeah, I mean, so trades increase, for example, England's treasure by foreign trade, I mean, to be honest, the wealth of the nations, right? The wealth of the nation, the title of Adam Smith. This is the wealth of the Commonwealth, the Commonweal, the Republic, like the benefit of not the people, right? Because they didn't actually conceive of people as a sort of political force in exactly the same way. This is sort of emerging in that time, but they're talking about the wealth of the nation. And even earlier on, they're talking even more specifically about the wealth of the monarch, the queen, when it was Queen Elizabeth, the king, when it's the other series of monarchs that took over afterwards. It's because that's considered, the wealth of the crown is considered to be the same in a sense as the wealth of the nation. So they're using these terms, and they are drawing upon these tropes in order to construct arguments that would appeal to the politicians, essentially the people that are in the parliament, the nobility, and the crown, and the other sort of offices of the government. And this is why, because their audience, they're trying to change trade policy. So their audience is essentially the government. And that's why they talk in these very nationalistic terms in order to capture the attention of these individuals and persuade them. Whereas the audience of the earlier medieval theologians is quite different.
Now, this was a large effort to maybe maintain monopolies or build upon them. Is this a new level of competition? And did they basically outcompete anybody who was in the older framework, thus building a new system?
Oh, yeah. So did the new economic authors sort of outcompete the kind of scholastic authors? They did. I mean, they kind of overwhelmed them. So the rate of texts written by scholastics or by ecclesiastics about economic, that touched on economic matters or were on economic matters, it doesn't change that much, but it says it's sort of a steady rate. But at the same time, this is the era of the printing press, of the, it's the era in which publishing becomes just like a huge business. So the rate at which all texts are being published is really increasing a lot. And the rate of people writing on economic texts also increases in England. It doesn't, like, strangely, it doesn't increase in the Dutch Republic. It doesn't increase in France. It's this English phenomenon, but it grows, and the number of merchant authors grows, and it just it grows enough that the proportion of texts that are kind of religious in nature shrinks to be a very small proportion of the overall.
This makes me think of, recently I talked with somebody about meritocracy in the current time versus like the 1950s, and how there's a new type of rich or wealthy that is very active and they have to be hardworking about what they're doing, versus 60 years ago, they just had things and we own a lot and they didn't do much, and it would be actually looked down upon to do a lot. So I notice how there's these trends where every 50 years, 100 years, whenever, there's a new competitive framework that we do this. And if you're doing this, that's the old way. And it doesn't matter how much you built in that system, that kind of disappears. There's a dynamic ebb and flow that goes on in our society. Now, as far as the merchants, what were some of the challenges they had getting their messages across?
Well, I mean, I think probably the basic challenge was this problem of legitimacy that they had. And so, the more successful authors, then you start to use the science, this idea of empiricism, which is developing at the time with Francis Bacon and the emergence of the Royal Society. So, although it's also true that there's a number of people that would say, and myself included, that these new merchant authors actually influenced Francis Bacon, and who was, they influenced him to also think more about using empirics and data gathered from the world itself in order to buttress arguments. Because, I mean, just to say the difference is that before, and again, in the scholastic arguments, they weren't using trade statistics. No one talked about trade statistics, or they were talking about, Aristotle said this, or, the Bible says this. And those are the key pieces of evidence that they use to support their arguments. These new merchant authors are doing something quite different. So the difference, so I just lost the thread about it. What was the question again?
Long live threads, and I lose the threads sometimes too. I want to put that out there for the listeners. It's good to be in the moment. And what is a challenge that the merchants had in getting their messages across? Difficulties maybe of legitimacy. What did they have to deal with that was tough?
Oh yeah. So I was talking about the solutions to that, which was these statistics. But the problem, I mean, it was really a lack of trust in the class of merchants themselves. I mean, merchants they're becoming more politically powerful. A larger proportion of people are gaining rights in England at this time, but it's exactly what you mentioned with this sort of interesting situation that you're still looked down upon if you engage in work. So, I mean, in the leisure class in the United States earlier, still managed to kind of retain some kind of moral superiority, I suppose, from not doing work. But it was really opposite at that time, so much so. Actually, my favorite example of it is there's Prince Xavier, the Portuguese king, and he had an overseas chartered company that he sent to the East Indies, and that the other kings made fun of him and called him the grocer king, because it was so beneath them to engage in commerce. But so they had this problem of being seen as lower class. They had this problem of being seen as base, only interested in materiality, not being the most honest of individuals. And that's exactly why they reached out for these other tools, like science, trade statistics, and also they would just do other things like write under pseudonyms, or not even write under. Sometimes they would claim to be other people. Josiah Child, who was a famous author of the time, wrote, and it's just amazing because the standards are so different. But he wrote in a preface that he was a completely disinterested individual that had no stake in the trade that he was describing whatsoever. When he was, the principal, the CEO of the company at the time. And the craziest thing about that, I swear, this is so.
What's the craziest thing?
The craziest thing is that preface is included in a later version of the manuscript, where he's acknowledged that he is the author. So like you could read that as the author and then read this like second preface where he states that he has no interest in the business. But I don't, it just didn't quite like bother them exactly in the same way. I mean, I guess it did, but who knows? I don't know how that happened or how people responded to it, but it seems amazing.
Strategic moves in the background.
Right.
That's pretty good. These stories, by the way, are the key elements. The steps along the way are the little power play interactions between people. That's how I feel like society has little shifts. They have to have these little moments of, no, we're gonna, oh, like for example, the moral authority of the church diminishing a bit at that time in relation to these facts and such. Can you speak about the transition? Did the church get reduced to nothing, or what happened there?
Oh, well, I mean, I suppose so. Like, I have to say, I'm not a scholar of the church. So there is a story there also that probably, I mean, this is the rise of Protestantism and religious clashes that tore apart England and the rest of Europe, and just having two different churches, of course, brought the kind of moral framework of Christianity into question in a way that it hadn't been previously. It still retained a pretty strong grip on, I would say, the sort of European consciousness, though, and even though the authors are talking about the benefit to the nation, but I mean, when there's no room for a purely secular argument. I mean, they don't make pure, so God and nation are kind of the two tenets that come in. It wasn't, I mean, at the time, so for example, Thomas Hobbes made a kind of a purely secular argument about governance in the same era, and he was really universally reviled for that. So these merchants wouldn't sort of take that. He's called the monster of Malmesbury because he made that secular argument. So these merchants are not, or I would say that the church still has a significant amount, and certainly the Christian ethos has a lot of continued cultural relevance for sure. It's not completely gone. Although there are some challenges, I would agree.
And one thing that comes to mind is you selected a specific period of time and to analyze material which was not fully, let's say, digitized. And there's like, it was almost like if I was analyzing it, it'd be like a gold mine and reaching out for it and figuring out dynamics along the way. That's cool to me. We look at like certain things and we make that brighter. Is there, if it came to mind, are there any other periods that would make as much sense to look at in that way, where there was text, or would that not be the case for like 800 AD or later on? Do you see any other time periods or frameworks that have the same kind of opening for analysis of terms and discussion?
Well, I mean, gosh, I think the medieval economy is just totally fascinating. If I could get data, for example, on there's these small towns that were created after the Crusades that were kind of trade hubs, and then there's the whole expansion of the Silk Road. I mean, there's so many moments of incredibly important commercial transition and sort of different there's, I mean, all across Asia, even earlier, there's these hubs of trade in Indonesia and in the Middle East that are so vibrant and cosmopolitan. And I think that the governments had very sophisticated ways of thinking about trade and how to benefit and free trade. And there's a lot of sort of embrace of free trade in those different port cities. The problem is that there's just not records of it as far as I know. So in a lot, so if you're on the equator, for one thing, the paper goods don't store very well because you don't have refrigeration, you don't have air conditioning, you don't have, so things just disintegrate. So there's not a lot of archival records from very warm areas just in general, which is means you just don't get the kind of systematic data that you need for this. I mean, to be honest, that's one of the reasons why I think there's so much written on English history is they just became obsessed with like taking records and writing everything down and keeping it in the archives. And so we can get to it in a way that you can't get to a lot of other history. If the data existed, I mean, and then also, of course, there's the early modern typeset is very hard to read, but it's probably easier than an illuminated manuscript or the different manuscripts that are created. But that I actually spent a lot of time reading logs from the English East India Company. And I'll tell you that if you read a log of a ship from the 16th century, it looks beautiful, like it looks amazing. It looks like Elven script from the Lord of the Rings, or like it's just so, it's very hard to read, very hard to read.
So it looks beautiful, but it's very hard to read.
Yes.
Dang. It's like for aesthetic purposes, but then as far as functionality, it's low on that one.
Well, it's just not quite, so I think it was probably easy for the people at the time to read, but it's not, the letters aren't formed the same way. The language is slightly different. That it just looks like a foreign language.
That makes sense. And now we're used to all these perfect fonts that everything is at the peak level of readability, or serif or sans serif for every little pixel in them. Transition over time. That's kind of cool.
And computers can read it. I mean, that's the other big thing, is that if it's regularized, then the computer can convert it into data that you can analyze. But that's I mean, I think probably it'll get better. The methods will improve. People are working on this problem, but it's not trivial reading irregular text or handwriting correctly.
Mm-hmm. That element is definitely not trivial, because I feel like there's just chunks of material that are left alone for now, but maybe in the future, maybe some artificial intelligence, machine learning thing will scan it. That's what I thought of a good chunk when I was reading through the book, that this is a specific moment. And then for current material and all the discussion that's happening right now on the internet and wherever text, it's all being run through Google or other companies' systems to examine top trends, mini trends, partial trends, how this relates to this, what's gone up 3% in the last year as far as discussion. So exactly your material, I see that we're doing like 80 million times that now through machines for the current moment. But it's maybe some of the past moment is left alone because it's not the current landscape of Twitter or wherever.
That is so true. And I think it's such a tragedy, actually. That so people focus so much on Twitter, but there's actually so much historical data out there that I think would be a lot more illuminating than just to look at Twitter trends over and over again. To be honest, I think we have bigger problems. We have problems with institutions, we have problems with democracy, we have problems with inequality, and I don't see how we can get a systematic perspective on those things without looking to history to see how these big institutions persist and change over time. And in order to do that, you have to sort of break out of this social media bubble that I think a lot of social scientists have kind of sort of inhabited. I mean, they've done a lot of really terrific work there. So you can develop in algorithms, search methods, it's like great data to develop methods. But I think it's true, the methods should be applied to different contexts, if possible.
That's funny. It's almost like I was talking to chemist Leroy Cronin at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and he said, "Oh, it all connects back to TikTok." So even though we have all this technology, it's going back to like little clips or dance videos on TikTok. Whereas, right, what you're saying, maybe applying it to decades and decades or centuries of thought and philosophy might be more applicable than making it to cause someone to have their attention maintained on a 3-second clip more, like 2% more. We must keep their attention.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
We can't click away. Now, actually on that one, I used to check this sometimes, but of the various social media and ways to consume and take in media, is there any you prefer to take in media or make media on?
Oh, gosh, I probably like Instagram best, I think, of the social media. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I have to say, I feel like Twitter people just complain on Twitter. Like Twitter is the place where no one else will listen to what you want to say. So you say it on Twitter. It seems like to me, like, so I don't know if I can't say I actually enjoy Twitter, but Instagram is kind of fun seeing pictures.
That makes sense. Now, a counter to that is the level of focus, let's say, that it takes to get all the data and whatnot together is something that is attention requiring. And so that I always see puts people into a very specific space that not many can get into. How have you gotten yourself into focus spaces to do that kind of research?
So do you mean the data cleaning process?
Well, that and like analysis of it, and then
Yeah.
putting it together for a message for all.
It is, well, it's true. I mean, I would say, cleaning data, finding data is pretty exciting. Cleaning data and making sure that you can analyze it is probably the most painful part of these kinds of projects. Like cleaning data, I don't know anyone that thinks cleaning data is that much fun, but you do get to know the data set better. If you clean it yourself, you really get to know it and develop a sort of intuitive feel for what's there and what you might get out of it. You do have to be just sort of dedicated in order to get through that stage, I think. But then you have the joy and the pleasure of, I mean, running analysis is so much fun. By the time you've cleaned the data, then you just almost you just type in a line and you can get a result. and it's so much fun to look at the visualizations. And then I mean, that's the great thing about doing data analysis, of course, is also it surprises you. It tells you things that you didn't know before. And it leads you down paths of sort of exploration and discovery that you wouldn't have been able to get from just reading a couple of different texts. So that part's, I think, a pleasure. And really the collation and all the cleaning is sort of, it's for that benefit because you're looking forward to that moment where you actually get to kind of explore. So I guess you have to be a very prudent person, right? I learned that prudent is when you're more focused on the future than on the present.
Is that a more specific form of prudent? Probably. Then yes.
I think that's the more specific definition. Yeah. So you have to be thinking the kind of person who like saves the best part of the dessert for last.
This is a key one. I've mentioned this a few times, the value of the Stanford marshmallow experiment, where if kids held on and waited for 2 marshmallows versus taking the one, 20 years, 30 years later, whatever, they were more successful because that simple delayed gratification meant that they could do that across the board in their decision making, their plans, their finances, their dealings with people. They wouldn't undercut people very quickly, more like they'd have a collaborative effort with them. So that's pretty substantial. And it's like I like that they broke it into a simple experiment showing that a long-term view, it almost, I sometimes think that the world agrees with our thoughts. So if we have a long-term view, then we are good in the long term. We're like, it matches us. And we have a short-term view, it's good in the short term. So it's almost like the earth matches directly what we plan for or set up for it, and then not beyond that. So as far as we plan out, but then if we don't plan out more than 5 years, after 5 years, things might break down because we didn't really set a foundation for that. That's pretty good. Now, one thing that comes to mind is you're at Yale University. Is there any specifics that Yale separated itself from other universities that you went there, or is there any things that while you have been there come to mind as very suitable for what you do?
Well, it's so funny. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about Yale is that Elihu Yale, the founder of Yale, he was actually a private trader in the East Indies. So he was one of these merchants that he made a lot of money on the diamond trade, in fact. But so he was one of these merchants that was participating in the discourse. Now, he wasn't an author of one of these early economic texts that I focus on, but he was definitely part and parcel of this kind of world and this transformational kind of class of merchants that really did produce a lot of change, not only in England and in North America, but around the world. So and the good and bad came out of that. Certainly, but Yale, the institution, I think, is a really terrific thing that came out of it. And there's not only this kind of historical connection to these companies and in particular the East Indies trade, but there's actually a really high concentration of people that work on the company. So I have some incredible colleagues. Julia Adams in my department, Douglas Rogers in anthropology. I'm going to forget, but it's a pretty amazingly high concentration of people that work on this area. And it also has just a truly incredible history department. So that's nice. So it's, in terms of my interests, I have a terrific kind of intellectual community to engage with on these specific circumstances, and then just more broadly, it's not only an extremely collegial and supportive group of scholars. I would say it's also a very inspiring group of people to be in conversation with. So it's a nice place.
It's nice to have an intellectual community to connect with.
Yes.
That's a cool feature. What is one message you would want people to take away from the book or their understanding of that specific company or of discourse or your analysis?
Well, I think the most important thing is that so this focus on national development and growth, I think it created a lot of things that were very positive. We know much more about economic theory now, I would say, because of this turn towards sort of scientific logic, rigor, trade data, statistics, empirical analysis. But I don't think it was necessary. It was just kind of historical circumstances to turn away from a sort of a moral perspective of how capitalism can and should unfold in society. And so I think hopefully the most important lesson that I hope people would take away from this is that that's historically contingent. And if it's historically contingent and it has to do with specific political and institutional, political and institutional context of the 17th century, then it's not written in stone in capitalism in any meaningful way, and that we can embrace a more moral and ethical way of thinking about commerce and exchange with other people. So I suppose the idea of writing about the history of this is kind of to hopefully loosen a little bit the grip of this idea that you have to be certainly that you have to be nationalistic about how you think about trade and development and growth and commerce and economics, but even more so that I think the best of both worlds would be to keep the logic and the rigor and the data, and you sort of re-import a little bit more of the kind of concerns for equity and fair exchange that were left by the wayside. And I think that's possible. And that hopefully this book would help with that process.
This is a great point. If something was put into place with a lot of effort, maybe it didn't fully have a natural base to it, and maybe the original way had some relevance for natural functioning. This is a great point. Professor Emily Erikson of Yale University, I would like to thank you for having been on this episode of the show and informing all of us.
Thank you, Armin. It was a great pleasure to meet you, and it was really fun to have this conversation.
Glad to. And we are out.